Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff.
Dean, I saw somebody on Blue Sky today say that they are listening to the entire Magnificast backlog.
Well,
what do you think about that idea?
I think that's a mistake. I would not recommend doing that.
Yeah, you could do a lot of other things.
Name one other thing you could do.
You could take a walk outside without listening to a podcast.
Okay, it's going to take them years to get to this specific episode. So
that's a great point.
When you get here, dear listener, I want you to know I've been praying for you the whole time. And I hope that this has been time well spent. And if it's not, I don't know, I'll see you in hell, I guess.
It sounds extremely purgatorial to be listening to the backlog of this podcast.
It really does. It feels, that's what it would be for me. Actually, purgatory will be just listening to our own podcast forever and being like, I don't agree with that anymore. I shouldn't have said that. I'd say that differently now.
Yeah, I mean, every week when I edit this podcast, I hear my own voice recorded, and it does make me want to purge something. So I feel like that's probably true. I feel like you're very close to a deep spiritual truth I'm uncomfortable with.
Yeah, but you're getting a head start. You're already doing some of the purgatorial work here on the side of eternity, so that's good for you.
That's true. No one ever thinks about how editing your own podcast is sort of like the mortification of the flesh. It's sort of like that if you think about it.
Yeah, I would definitely be mortified if I listened to
it. Cool. Well, let's get this mortification going. Dean, what are we talking about this week?
Okay, we've been talking about garbage. We've been going to the dump, and probably we will go back to the dump later on. But Matt and I have been really desperately trying to finish the degrowth book. And it's the only thing I can think of. I can't think of anything else. I can't think of even how to make dinner. All I can do is think about degrowth and what we should say about it. And just today, actually, I feel like we're probably, I would say we're 90% of the way done. Is that too optimistic to say?
I feel like it's more than 90%. Like, if the content is nearly written.
That's true. The second and even third draft of many of the chapters are totally done, and our editor said they were very good. So I feel like that's all we need.
She put a gold star on them. She stamped them with like a little apple and a worm coming out and said, "Good job." And what more do you need from that? I don't know. That's it.
What that means is you are also, all dear listeners, about to be subjected to degrowth content because we've been. But I think actually the home stretch here has been tying together a lot of cool threads that we've been exploring on the podcast for a long time. And we're going to give people another preview of some of the material in the book. You can buy the whole thing and I guess read it from start to finish. It won't feel as bizarre as two people randomly talking about it every month or so. I don't know, maybe it still will. I shouldn't promise that. But I think we've stumbled on some pretty interesting material. We've been kind of rereading a ton of old liberation theology stuff. And we talk a lot about liberation theology in the Global South on the show here and there. But this time we went through and started trying to dig up what were people in the Global North saying about liberation theology as they were reading it. How did they respond to it? What did they feel kind of compelled to do or think about or change and so on? And I think as Christians in the Global North now, trying to figure out degrowth, that's also a question that we have. What are we supposed to do with all this stuff in the Global South that feels compelling, important, feels like stuff we should be accountable to, and so on? And, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's all kinds of really good stuff already out there. And we decided to pull some of that together in a chapter and then add maybe our own take and a few spins. But I think that's what we're going to do in this episode. We're going to pull out a few really interesting voices in the Global North talking about the challenges of solidarity with the Global South, what that would really commit us to in an age of global capitalism. How does that sound, Matt?
It sounds so good. I can't wait to tell everybody about these interesting responses from the Global North about, dependency theory and liberation theology and stuff. That's all really cool. Just as you were saying this, it sort of struck me. Sorry, this is like an aside. I'm taking us down a quick side road. We've done a few of these episodes so far where we have talked about some of the book content, and it's just dawning on me that a lot of the content that we've talked about with regards to the book on this podcast has actually been edited out of the book. So something very cool is if you go back and listen to some of these episodes where we're talking about book content or just trying out an idea on the podcast or something, it is actually not in the book. So you'll have to get the book to see what's actually in the book. Which is cool, which is a great idea, sort of a marketing ploy from us where we tell you something is in the book and then it's not in the book in the end. And anyways, this part is probably going to make it in there though. So I don't know what to say about that.
Well, you'll have to get the book and see. That's the key.
Yeah, you'll never know for sure until you have it in your hands. So yeah, great point.
All right. So you've got to get the book, but guess what? Right now you can't. So like I said, we're giving you a special preview and you can see how it compares by the time it actually gets to print. So as I said, a lot of responses from the global north to the global south, many more than we even included in here. There's a bunch of theologians that kind of got a reputation for writing and reading about the south. I'll mention some that we don't talk about, I guess. So there's people like the Germans, Jürgen Moltmann and Johann Baptist Metz, and a handful of other people in that part of the world who were very invested in Latin American theology and vice versa. The Latin Americans were also invested in what they were doing. Lots of really interesting French connections between like France and Belgium and so on, and especially French-speaking parts of the world, Africa and elsewhere, parts of Asia. And Haiti in particular, and lots of interesting stuff too from the Anglophone world, the US, the UK, elsewhere, where people were really just trying to sort out, like, how do you take responsibility for a global capitalist world? And I feel like you could, and somebody should write an entire book about how global North theologians responded to liberation theology. We didn't do that. We wrote a section of a chapter of a book about how a few of them did that. And I guess we're just going to walk people through, starting with the first person in here, a woman named Sister Marie Augusta Neal, who in 1977 wrote this book called A Socio-Theology of Letting Go. And the whole premise of the book is basically that when you look at the structures of world capitalism, it's pretty obvious that people in the global north are benefiting from the hyper-exploitation of people in the global south. And in order for people in the south to be liberated, people in the global north are going to have to get used to some big changes. We're going to have to let go, as she puts it, of our kind of place of privilege in the world, so the US shouldn't be allowed to like call the shots to everybody else. We'll have to probably let go also of certain consumer conveniences that we enjoy. She's writing this already in the 70s, so imagine how much more true it is many, many decades later. And I think it's a really interesting pitch. The way that she summarizes it is she says, we need a theology of letting go such that when the 2/3 of the world not advantaged by the system as it now exists reach out for what is theirs, those who have a firm grasp on it, upon far more than they need to be humanely satisfied, will release their grasp. And she talked too about a theology of relinquishment, that we had to kind of relinquish our power and position of authority and privilege. And we'll talk about some complications with all that, but I think it's pretty impressive that, as I mentioned already in the 70s, she's kind of coming to these conclusions. And it's funny, after reading all this degrowth stuff, in a funny way, theologians had already anticipated, I think, a lot of the stuff that feels really novel about degrowth, like talking about downscaling consumption and production, talking about those kind of global inequalities. But because of that, maybe like moral horizon and the international nature of theology and Christianity, there's already this kind of recognition of what degrowth practically is calling for, even if it's done with a different vocabulary. I felt like that was a pretty cool surprise to find when we were researching.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, a lot of this is, it's responding directly to dependency theory and to the underdevelopment of a handful, of global South countries. So, you can see the sort of, there's an analog between that conversation and the one that's happening in degrowth today. So yeah, I guess it's interesting, and the contours of those conversations are really similar, which makes our book particularly good and cool. But yeah, anyways, I think it's an interesting call. It's like there's something extremely passé about being like an anti-consumerist person, or being like, oh man, you don't really need to own so much stuff, just think about it. People hate it. It grates on you. It seems sort of like naive and stupid in a lot of ways. But I feel like the ways that liberation theologians are talking about it is a little bit different than like the crunchy the crunchy moms of the 1990s or whatever. I don't know. Sort of like anti-consumerist messages have a little bit of a different bite to them when they are connected to sort of like a global movement or actually considering like the supply chain of capitalism or something in the ways that global economies are interconnected. So the whole idea of relinquishment seems a lot more interesting to me than sort of just like anti-consumption or something like that, because this is it's you know, it's not that like things are bad, but everyone should have enough things, and that is possible. That kind of world is possible, so we should just give up a little bit so everyone can have enough, you know.
Yeah, I agree. And I agree too with the kind of linking of material status or anti-consumerism with a more general theory of power as well. And that seems to be what's unique about Neil's approach here, that we relinquish not only our like certain material comforts, but also this kind of, I guess, like unearned privilege of telling the rest of the world what to do. So the US is running around, right, especially in the 70s, being like, change your government, accept the structural adjustment program, you know, trying to like shape the whole world in competition with the Soviet Union. And the idea that part of getting rid of our position of like material comfort should also come along with refusing to occupy that role. That's a more sophisticated kind of critique than the anti-consumerist stuff that you see in the 90s and later.
Yeah, big time. It has a way different vibe on it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, coming up with like a theology of letting go or of relinquishment, man, you couldn't ask for something better to talk about degrowth alongside of the. It's so like the someone went back in time and sent the sister the talking points, and I appreciate that.
That's right. You know, before we go to the next bit here, someone who doesn't get in the book, here's some great content that won't be in the book, but you can get by listening to this podcast ahead of time. And you'll forget about it for sure by the time you get to the book, I'm sure. But interesting trivia nonetheless. You know, degrowth people will also often point out that there have been critics of growth for longer than degrowth has been around. You know, degrowth is kind of it's an umbrella term. It emerged also in the 70s, but it kind of caught on more like in the last, 3 decades, you could say. But there have been criticisms of growth from a variety of different kind of vantage points for a long time. And degrowth is now kind of knitting those together in an interesting way. But among Christians, that's also true. So not only do you have people like Neil, there's also this guy who's not a liberation theologian, but kind of an interesting character. His name is Bob Goudswaard. He's a Dutch Christian economist. He is not exactly an anti-capitalist, but also not a regular capitalist. He's a weird Dutch Christian guy. But his whole thing was being like, I think that growth is a really bad goal for society and for economies. And as a Christian, I like fundamentally oppose growth as the kind of metric or goal of society. And he was writing that stuff also in the 70s and 80s. He wrote a book that I did quote somewhere in our book, with a really funny title called Aid for the Overdeveloped West. And I think it's such a great idea that like we always think of underdeveloped so-called countries needing aid from the North. But he's like, actually, societies in the North need a lot of aid. It's just that the aid is in the form of, less material resources and deeper forms of solidarity. So just to say, there's actually a lot of precedents, I think, for Christians anticipating degrowth, although not all of them in a liberating direction, but not necessarily in a bad one either, just a different one maybe.
Very similar to Tissa Balisaria's mission to the global North.
Right.
We need so much help up here, guys.
Somebody save these people from themselves. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, let's hit the next one then.
All right. So we got a voice from the US in the mix here. But there's also a really great theologian in Canada. I'm pretty sure we've talked about him sometime on the show, maybe not. But his name is Gregory Baum. He was a really interesting guy. He's a convert to Catholicism. His family was Jewish, and they left as refugees from World War II. And he also was gay, and he was ordained for a while. Just lots of interesting things about him. But anyway, he ended up in Canada at a certain point, and then he moved to Quebec, which is a whole another set of stuff to think about. Just a wild, impressive guy. He also helped to contribute to the writing of Nostra Aetate, which is a Vatican II document about Christianity's relationship with Judaism and Jewish people. Anyway, these are all interesting, trivial things about a cool Canadian theologian. but he also was super invested in liberation theology and in solidarity. So he was a member of Christians for Socialism, for example. He did a lot of work kind of traveling around to liberation theology gatherings and sort of like being a really good synthesizer and a fly on the wall. He has a lot of writings where he's just sort of like reporting on liberation theology conferences and being like, here's sort of what happened, this is what people thought, and so on, but in a way that is very useful. And then he would apply that kind of knowledge to what it means to be in Canada and a Canadian. And I think that is really important because often when we think of global imbalances, we think of the US especially, and then maybe Europe, but we don't often think of Canada or these kind of, I guess, like still structurally advantaged capitalist countries, but not in the same way. So anyway, he's doing it. In a book that he wrote called Compassion and Solidarity, he is talking about the kind of transformation in the Canadian church toward a mission of justice. And he says when you start learning about all these different things, like the ways that our lives are made possible by suffering in the global south, you might naturally have like a kind of feeling of guilt or like self-aversion, being like, whoa, I can't believe that I personally am responsible for all this stuff. Like think of our episode last week, maybe, where, you know, you use a coffee pod and the bauxite used to make that coffee pod might have come from a violent mine in the country of Brazil. So Baum's like, we might feel kind of guilty. But he has this kind of interesting proposal where he says we shouldn't feel guilty. Instead, we should respond with a feeling of mourning or a process of mourning. And I think that is really fascinating. He talks too about a really explicit attempt to do that. There was a kind of like service or workshop in Quebec that he attended where they did like a mourning service for the victims of imperialism and trying to think through your own kind of complicity in that. And the mourning, again, is kind of like a recognition of the fact that people in the North are sort of like conscripted into an imperial mode of living. So when you're a baby, you know, you don't wake up. Well, when you're a baby, you don't think about anything at all, I guess. But when you're a baby, you know, like nobody chooses to be born into a kind of like structurally advantaged or disadvantaged position relative to global capitalism. You just kind of end up there. And over time, you also don't choose to keep participating in it, except insofar as you like maybe, I don't know, give it your tacit consent or like you don't drop out of it or whatever. But society is like conspiring to keep you in that position of enjoying that consumptive mode of living. And I think Baum's idea that we can respond to that with a posture of mourning is really helpful. And he doesn't say that you should kind of like stop there so that you're just like bummed out. But instead, he says that kind of condition of mourning can clear the space to then actually like confront those structures of injustice. And I felt like that was a cool sideways sort of take on first world guilt that is pretty interesting, deserves a little more attention.
Something that really strikes me about this particular emphasis on mourning as sort of like a jumping off point towards solidarity is that Christianity is extremely, at least evangelical Christianity, the kind of Christianity that is like imprinted on my soul that I can never sort of shake off, is really bad at kind of figuring this part out. Because a lot of Christian constructions of agency are really about blame and guilt and not recognition and mourning.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, you know, a huge problem, I would say, psychologically and theologically and socially and everything else, right? But for a lot of evangelical Christians, I mean, maybe don't let me speak for you. I guess if this is not your experience, then I can stop saying it. But it seems like it seems like something that I've noticed happen in other people who have been in evangelicalism. It's always your fault for doing something stupid. It's your fault for causing someone to stumble. It's your fault for like doing a big sin. You're cheating on your homework. You're lying to your parents. All of the most gravest and deep sins that you can do. And, you know, like whatever. And that type of guilt gets passed on to like basically every type of sin. And that, like, you know, the only thing you can do is feel bad because you're such an idiot for doing this with the great life that God's given you. But I appreciate the Gregory Baum approach here because it's letting you recognize that there's evil in the world and that even you're caught up in it. but that you're not necessarily the author of that evil, that you're not like solely complicit or something. Mm-hmm. Not letting you off the hook, not like any of that, not negating any of the ways that you are like, involved in it, but also recognizing that you couldn't escape it if you really wanted to even. Mm-hmm. I appreciate that as like as a general framing for like recognizing something bad that you're caught up in. I think that is a lot healthier than just like the expeditious, like I've done something wrong and I should feel bad about it in a guilty sort of way. That so much of Christianity kind of like offers up to it. So anyways, I think that's great. If that can be a spot where we can say like, yes, these are now, now I understand the problem, and like, even though I can't change it, but now I want to be sort of like in solidarity with those people. That is, I think, a deeply positive spiritual practice.
Yeah, it's like we don't have a lot of spaces in Christianity to just say like, this sucks. You know what I mean? Like, and just kind of like leave it at that. Like, it sucks, and you personally saying it sucks is also not going to change that in the short term. But maybe you could like say that it sucks, clear a little bit of space to then, figure out what it is that you could do to make it suck a bit less. Join other people in an organized way who are trying to make it suck a bit less instead of trying to internalize all of that shitty feeling into yourself and like identifying with it in a personal way.
Yeah, definitely. Dean, before we move on to somebody else, another global North person talking about liberation theology, do you want to talk about the mystical side of Baum, like the thing that he's got going on there with the Via Negativa? I think that's kind of interesting stuff that maybe we should lay out as well.
Yeah, for sure. So Baum, he's talking about mourning this situation. He also is interested in how Christianity kind of like supports the situation of global capitalism, and what would it mean to really take responsibility for that, and how would we like free ourselves as Christians from that reality. And to sort that out, he taps into a mystical tradition called the Via Negativa, or the Way of Negation. And it's actually the oldest form of mysticism in Christianity. It's the idea that you negate every single thing that you could say about God. Even like really, tried and true things like God is love and all that kind of stuff. You're like, no, God is beyond all these things in this really wild way. And you get into, by the time you get to people like Meister Eckhart, you also have people being like, and God, you could even rid me of the idea of God. What a wild thing to say.
Yeah, right.
Really cool, fascinating stuff. It has often been associated with also a kind of revolutionary impulse in Christianity. Anyway, Baum taps into that, and he says that we have to first negate as untrue everything that is said of God when we're in that kind of global oppressive situation. And I think like when we talk about a growth-oriented society where our understanding of God or our faith are shaped by growth, it's pretty easy to see how that cashes out, right? Like you have extreme versions of it in the form of the prosperity gospel, where God is like identified with growth specifically. But you also have this, I guess, like more shaped kind of way of thinking. I don't know, there's a better way to put that, but like I've been in, lots of church meetings where people are concerned about whether or not a congregation is growing or a ministry is growing. And I guess you can end up really spinning your wheels to keep it going, even if that's at the expense of people who make those institutions or ministries or communities worth maintaining in the first place. And I think Baum's challenge to be like, let's negate all the stuff that we say about a God who society tells us is like approving of all that stuff in a capitalist society. We have to negate all that stuff to kind of clear space. And then Baum says once we do that, we could kind of have that deeper solidarity with people in the South. And the goal is not to like quit believing in God per se, but to figure out like once we've negated all that, all of the idolatrous God that supports oppression, then maybe we could actually encounter God in an important way. And he concludes with a funny kind of line. If they yearn for justice and question their society, Canadians are not excluded from contemplation and ecstasy. Which I think is a great way to sign off, being like, listen, if you just, think about what's wrong with Canadian society, then don't worry, you don't have to be bummed about it all the time. And Baum himself is not a very depressive kind of writer. When you read him, there's a lot of joy in his work as well. But you kind of get this mysticism of liberation where you don't like retreat into yourself or end up doing like self-flagellation, but you're kind of opened up to engaging the world in a committed way, ready to work with other people to change that situation. I think there's a lot there. There's a kind of recurring theme of mysticism and liberation too. I mean, in people like Boff, of course, in the Global South, but also like Dorothy Zuela talks about it a ton, and tons of other people. So there's a deep like mystical pattern to trying to like clear a space to become a more liberating agent in the world.
Yeah, I really appreciated this like particular use of the way of negation. I have read a lot of Paul Tillich in my time, kind of a way of negation sort of guy who does a similar Meister Eckhart thing, but with a different philosophical bent, I guess. And I've always found that kind of thing really interesting, but I really appreciate this one because it is also interesting and kind of like a radical, the radical impulse that you were mentioning a minute ago. Lately, I've been having sort of an on-again, off-again situation with TikTok where I don't really want to waste my time watching TikToks, but sometimes I just get like sucked into it and can't really look away. And I stumbled upon this TikTok video the other night that was just like a handful of people at like a evangelical worship situation where there was like a band on stage. And everyone was like dancing and shouting words to a song that they all apparently knew. And, I could not even tell you like what sort of worship song it was, but you know the type, I'm sure. Like you could kind of, if I just said a worship song, you can kind of imagine one in your mind where like the words are about how God is really strong and he's really big and God could lift up several school buses.
He's getting bigger and bigger before our eyes.
His muscles are huge. He's hitting the gym. He's drinking his protein shakes. I don't know. But anyways, I was thinking of all the ways that like even just in like stupid worship music that capitalist ideas, whether they are like explicitly economic or they're just like extremely stupid, get kind of like set into a theological frame, and just like finding ways to say no to all of that is extremely healthy. And if it tells you also that capitalism is bad, it's even better. So that's cool.
Yeah, we need a revolutionary Hillsong. Is that what you're saying? I don't know how I feel about that, but maybe I'd
probably
be willing
not
to try.
That. Yeah, theological spoon, but Hillsong is not probably very cool. I don't know.
That's kind of what the Psalters were, actually, now that I think about it.
That's true, man. What a time. A band that's now 25 years old or whatever. 25 years gone. They're no longer existing in the world.
If you don't know who the Psalters are, actually, I feel like it's important to, now that we're getting older, we're becoming an older cohort of progressive Christians, I feel like it's really important to pass down the lore of extremely weird, crusty anarchist Christianity to those who will never have a chance to encounter it. This is a kind of aside, but also kind of related. The Psalters, they were a crust punk, anarchist, anti-civilizationist Christian band in the, I don't know, like late 90s, 2010s, 2000s, who knows exactly.
I saw them in like 2007, 2008, so
yeah,
somewhere around then.
Yeah, they would drive around in, I don't know, some wild jalopy of a machine.
There's a black school bus.
Yeah, black school bus. That's right.
and it ran on French fry oil. And very importantly, yes. This is not a joke. This is not like us making a goofy thing. This is a real band that existed that did drive around in a black school bus that did run on French fry oil, and they sang songs about sort of like God and how God's like a big bear that guards you or something, and capitalism sucks. Lots of great stuff. Lots of like appropriation of like ancient Christian prayers. I think the only reason I ever really learned like a lot of them were because of Psalter songs, and then I would like hear them in an Episcopal church years later and connect the dots that's what's going on. Pretty cool.
Yeah. They are the reason that I knew who Donald Rumsfeld was when I was a young person, because I had a very funny play on like an old spiritual talking about Donald Rumsfeld, and I had to look that person up. So, a great kind of conscientizing band. Anyway, a really good degrowth Christian band that I would never want to pattern my life after, but do appreciate having encountered. Anyway, they're like Hillsong because they would like roll into your town or a festival or something like that. I lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan, an extremely weird Christian place, and they would roll into there and do all kinds of weird stuff. But they would like really get the crowd going with all these kind of wild Christian songs, using a variety of like weird instruments, and the band always had 1,000 people in it at different times. Anyway, just kind of reminiscing at this point, but here's why it's kind of connected. I guess it's kind of connected because there is this sort of sort of sense that maybe there could be alternative forms of Christianity in the global north that we're trying to like live off the entrails of the beast rather than, appreciate the privileges that it affords you. And Psalters are maybe one, unfortunately, kind of like now missing presence of that kind of willingness to be weird.
Yeah, that's right. I remember in like, it was probably 2008 or 2009, they stopped at the Christian university I was attending, and they played a show, and it was cool. They did their whole thing, but then they also talked about how like they had spent like, months and months living in like Afghanistan or something with people. And like, they told everyone about like, Afghanistan, which is cool because like, I don't know, what do a bunch of Christian college kids in the middle of the Midwest know about what's going on in Afghanistan? Like, and they told us, so that was great.
Yeah. Pretty rad. What were we talking about before the Psalters?
Mysticism, Hillsong.
Right.
Yeah.
Hillsong. Right. Okay. We can stop talking about that.
It's done. It's over. I'm cutting the tape right there. No problem.
Great. All right. Let's talk about another voice in the global north trying to pull some of these pieces together. Dorothy Zoila. Matt, do you want to talk about her?
Yeah, I think so. This one is probably my favorite one of the few that we've kind of brought in. I don't know why. Dorothy Zoila is an interesting person, and this particular essay is very fun for a lot of different reasons. She has a lot of mean things to say about consumerism. Mean and true, I think, is it. And I don't know. I'll just like set it up here for a minute. When we're reading like liberation theology from the global south, and even like Black liberation theology in the global north, you hear a lot about the Book of Exodus. You hear about all these people crying out for liberation from slavery. You hear like that type of like frame used as a story about liberation from all types of oppression, right? And Dorothy Zoila, she's a German theologian who's like writing from the United States, and was visited the United States, all this kind of stuff. She's writing though about how like we're still living in an Egypt situation, right? From the context of like global capitalism, there's still a group of people who are oppressed, and there's a group of people who are, kind of doing the oppressing. But like in the global north, that is like a hard thing for us to read because, who are we in that story? Are we the people who are oppressed, who are looking for like passage out of Egypt or whatever, the Exodus story? Or are we the people who are like, are we Egypt? I guess is basically what Dorothy Zoila is asking. She explains that like we have this consumerist type of Egypt where we live in an oppressive situation alongside people in the other parts of the world. And that our consumerism is really like a big piece of that oppression to like satiate the needs, to like satiate the desires of people in the global north. The people of the global south have to live in this like sort of disadvantaged, I think is a very polite way of saying it. I don't know, disadvantaged way, in a way of in a mode of economic underdevelopment. You have to live under capitalist oppression and exploitation, right? That's it. Part of what she's asking us to do in the global north is think about that relationship, and not just like the material relationship. The liberation theologians of the global south have already told us all about that, but we need to start to think about like, what does liberation mean for us, for the people of Egypt who are stuck in these like cycles of consumerism. And she thinks that means like a liberation from the type of consumerism that mediates basically every part of our life. An image that she goes back to several times throughout this essay is like this. I don't exactly even know what, but it's sort of like an imagined couple on TV that she's constantly referring to. And it's very funny because she's like, if you see a couple who are out in the world and they're in love, they have like a particular aura around them. That they're in love with each other. They have this like type of sweet relationship. But if you see a couple on TV, they don't have this type of aura. They don't have this type of like obvious sweetness with one another. It's something that's just like completely mediated. It's a sign that is itself consumeristic, but it's like mediated by consumption as well. So basically, she thinks that like everything in our life has been sort of subsumed through consumption, through buying things, and we should kind of figure that out. Because not only is it like a spiritual malady that has been thrust upon us, but it's also, you know, strangling the other half of the world. In this essay, Zuela says this: our need for liberation has a different starting point than the struggle for economic justice. Our being exploited is different from the exploitation of the third world. Even though our exploitation is different and that it like manifests in a different way, consumption rather than like economic exploitation. I mean, not to say that people in the global north are also not economically exploited, but like our economies are different and we have different types of, you know, structural advantages. But all that being said, like, it's still the same thing that is ruling over all of us, the third world and first world people. So that like, while our experience of the world of like this big, the big capitalist beast that rules over everything is like the hedonistic side rather than the oppressive side. It's still the same thing. And that liberation is still sort of required, not just for people in the global south, but also for people in the global north. So it's a lot of the ideas in Zuela's piece end up kind of looking for a type of spirituality of simplicity, one where we can kind of reclaim a type of life that is beyond overconsumption and like direct satisfaction through like a Amazon package or whatever. Kind of like the thing that we've been talking about with Pope Francis that we've mentioned in previous weeks about like a healthy sobriety that you just kind of take a step back and you say like, well, I don't really actually need all of these things that are there for no reason. You know, whatever, all the things that you are being sold constantly on a TikTok shop are just like not really, not really worth it in the long run. But yeah, I don't know. It's a cool piece. It's kind of funny because there is like an implicit media analysis that I appreciate in it. That you know, TV is the couple on TV is the one that is sort of like empty. That's just like the projection of capitalism that I think is actually kind of interesting in this piece. But yeah, I mean the whole thing is interesting to consider that, you know, the system of global capitalism is one that we are directly involved in, right? And we are complicit in through consumption. But rather than feeling bad about that or like, you know, feeling guilty or too guilty, I guess, about it, she suggests that we just need to recognize that like the thing, it's not like that we're doing it. The same thing that is oppressing the people in the third world is the same thing that is like instilling us with these consumptive desires and sort of shallow relationships in the global north. And that thing is unsurprisingly capitalism.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the idea that people in the North need to be liberated from consumer capitalism as well is a hard thing to like talk about and get right. And I respect the way that she tries to do it. And I think the more you think about consumerism, the more you also recognize everybody knows that it sucks. Like no average person really thinks consumerism is awesome. And I think if you get people talking enough, you know, people will readily admit like it sucks to be constantly advertised to or to have like your life interrupted by commercials or billboards or whatever. It sucks to feel like you got to have the new thing that everybody wants every season, all that kind of stuff. The pressure to like keep up with fads and all that. You know, these are all like, these are not oppressive in the way that like a dam in Brazil breaking and destroying your entire community is oppressive, but it is existentially oppressive in a way that bears itself out with like, you know, increasing rates of depression and isolation and anxiety and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's like helpful for her to say that we too are stuck in a kind of Egypt. It's just that we identify with the Egyptians and like don't really want to get out in this really weird way. It's kind of like, you know, in the Exodus story, everybody leaves and then they start complaining immediately to Moses and they're like, bring us back. We got to go back. At least back in Israel, we got like, or back in Egypt, we got a reliable dinner or whatever. And, you know, Moses has to explain to them that is not actually good. That's like a bad situation. I think the irony is that like we're kind of, we have that attitude, except that we're also still in Egypt. We're like, I don't want to leave because at least I like get my, I don't know, cheap goods or whatever. So there's something to that about like, how do we get free in the global north from the system that's also messing with us in a bad way? Maybe
to bring it back to trash for 1 second. All of that stuff that we're constantly being sold and that we are agonizing over and that causes us so much isolation and anxiety, it does just, it comes from the trash and it's trash immediately. It's like so frustrating to see the types of hold these things have over us, mentally and spiritually and economically or whatever. Again, just scrolling through TikTok, seeing people like hook things on TikTok shop is like insane. Like, oh man, what you need is one more water bottle. You dumb idiot. You want to save the planet? Stop using plastic water bottles. You got to buy just one more and then you'll have it. And then you'll have it. And then you'll have done it. And that's awesome. My wife, she was very interested in this, like a handful of these, like influencers who were kind of about like minimalism, which is fine, whatever, that's cool. But then she got really fed up with it though, because everyone in like the minimalist influencer circle would be like, okay, you want to be a minimalist, you want to own so few things, but what you got to have is this thing that holds all of your toiletries. It's just like this very funny relationship where you're trying not to have things. You want to have as few things as possible, sort of a neat and tidy life without too much stuff, but you got to just have this like one more bag to put all of your things in, and then you'll have done it. Just insane that we are tricked into this over and over again, and it like rules so much of our lives. It's terrible.
One more bag, bro. That's all.
Bro.
So yeah,
one more water bottle. Just do it. Just get this water bottle.
All right, there's a couple more theologians we want to talk about. We're running close to the end. A quick aside, you can buy the book to learn this part. This is I think a juicy part, so this will be the tantalizing preview. People are always accusing degrowth of being like, they're disingenuously criticizing degrowth as being an ascetic movement or like a monastic movement where everybody has to like be boring and miserable and not have anything they like and not enjoy their life and just not consume anything ever again. And that, I'm here to tell you, is dumb. If somebody says that, you can just dismiss them as not being smart or being illiterate, I guess. But we, in the book, take the controversial move of saying, actually, what if it is ascetic, but asceticism is good, insofar as asceticism is a kind of like practice that we engage to change our habits. Monasticism, too, a really interesting sort of example of how when people live together in community, you find that resources actually stretch a lot further than they would otherwise. So anyway, you can read the whole book, figure out that, and tell people off, I guess, more appropriately. But let's skip all that.
What a funny take for a book to be like, okay, you're gonna love this crazy pitch we have about asceticism. You're gonna freak out once
you're gonna lose your mind when we have these paragraphs about asceticism for sure. It's here's why I do think it's actually interesting. Not only because of critics, but also like degrowth authors themselves will be like, critics say that we're ascetics. No, we're definitely not. Asceticism, that sucks. Degrowth, it's not like that. But in our book about Christianity and degrowth, we're like, actually, what if it is asceticism and what if that rules? So you can hear a doubly contrarian take. I think that's pretty exciting to find in a book.
Yeah, I think it should be a pretty obvious point that actually asceticism is not a bad thing, or monasticism is not a bad thing. Both are not bad things. But like, if you've ever visited a monastery for like, a day or two and you kind of hung out and you just see sort of the type of community that people have there, I don't know, you wouldn't be like, yeah, monasticism, obviously stupid. It's like, no, it's a vibrant community where people know each other and like work together. I don't know, man. Like, we don't have to go like that hard on it, but I think that there's a lot of things to be learned from monasticism as a sort of harmonious type of community. It's good.
Yeah, my wife is actually at a monastery right now and is already threatening to not come back. So I don't know. Maybe I'll have to go find her there. Yeah. Okay, so the last couple theologians on the list here. One is a guy named Lee Cormie, who is originally from the US, then moved to Canada, and is an extremely nice guy. I've talked to him a bunch of times. A very cool liberation theologian. He still lives in Canada. Interesting guy. He pointed out, I think, actually a really important kind of wrinkle in all of these sorts of approaches that we've talked about so far. In an essay, he says that the thing about theologies of relinquishment and so on is that they are, cool, but like he's saying, not saying like don't do it. But he says it can also kind of risk buying into the lie that capitalism is a system for guaranteeing the comforts and economic security of people in the North without recognizing that promise is not only a broken promise for the South, where it's like, if you guys just develop, we'll end poverty. It's also a broken promise in the North. The capitalism fundamentally just can't deliver on that. And, like a lot of people in the global North can't they struggle to survive as well, right? It's not like everybody is in a position of like comfortable consumption or even has the privilege of imagining like relinquishing or letting go the kind of comfort that they've achieved. And Cormy points out specifically that not only are like the statistics around poverty and all that kind of stuff kind of evidence of that, but even the fact of liberation movements that crop up in the North, like Black liberation movements, women's liberation, etc., they prove that the benefits of capitalism are not equally distributed in the North. And he doesn't say that like that means dependency theory is wrong, for example. Like he affirms that there is a global rate of inequality between the South and North that is inexcusable and obvious, and like value is absolutely transferred out of the South into the North. All that stuff is true. But once it gets to the North, it's not like it gets equally distributed and then people are kind of able to enjoy the fruits of that imperialism across the board. And I think it's a good nuanced take. It's like not denying the problem. The problem is real, the problem of overconsumption. But saying that like when we talk about addressing it, we also have to tend to those, those kind of wrinkles in the reality of our own social fabric.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A good wrench to throw into the works and like make us stop and think about that for a second. The thing that I keep thinking about though when I was reading this is that like it's true that in the global North there are still communities, especially racialized communities, who are excluded from the the type of like comfort and advantage that you get in other racialized communities. Like we're talking about anti-Blackness, right? Like that's basically what I'm trying to name without naming it for whatever reason. I don't know why I'm doing that. But it's like interesting though, because even like that's true, that exists. I think that's right. But like the thing that sticks out to me though is that there are even types of consumption that are open across lines of like disadvantaged communities and so on, and even though bigger things are excluded like healthcare or something, right? Like that's type of like a consumption that is hard to obtain because of how expensive it is and how much capital you actually need access to or something to get it.
Yeah, and I think all the contradictions are hard to parse because, for example, even if you are a person of low income, if you buy stuff at the dollar store or you even like buy coffee or buy groceries or, I don't know, have to like pay more money than you have to fix your car or, make a hard choice about buying a cell phone, all that kind of stuff. When you consume, you're kind of inevitably drawn into those unjust relationships.
Yeah,
so you might not be able to do that at the rate of other people, but you're not able to escape it by virtue of being poor either. And which Cormy also points out. But I think that's like attending to all those contradictions is hard, but important because it is true.
Yeah, right. That makes sense.
He also goes on to kind of point out that the key is not to say, again, that like the dynamics between North and South are not real, but instead to say all these liberation struggles have to kind of find their way together. And he says they are already doing that. Like he's not recommending it. He's like observing that. And I think that is great, like being like the anti-imperialist struggle is already an anti-racist struggle, is already a struggle against the patriarchy. We can add many other things, anti-colonialism, etc. Or at least that it has to kind of keep moving in that direction. One thing I think is interesting is when you look at other liberation theologians, though, in the global North, you already see a trending in that direction. So thinking of people like James Cone, who was extremely invested in international solidarity. He was close to Gustavo Gutierrez, for example, in Peru. He did a lot of work with the freedom struggle in South Africa and other parts of Africa. and participated a lot in international liberation theology meetings and so on. And he himself says in a number of places that the kind of encounters between Black liberation theology in the U.S. and Latin American theology in particular kind of helped the folks in the U.S. figure out that capitalism is a unique and important factor of analysis that you can't really get rid of, and then vice versa, that the Latin Americans were confronted with the reality that they had to treat race in a way that they didn't, and which is pretty inexcusable also, given that there's a lot of racial discrimination and injustice in Latin America in a big way. So the point being that those are like mutually supportive kinds of struggles, and I guess it kind of proves Cormy's point, and also proves that you don't really have to choose between like some of these or others.
That makes sense. I don't know. Always appreciate when somebody can like make the whole conversation a bit more complicated, and he definitely does that. Dean, do you want to bring it home with, sure, with one final person?
Yeah. So maybe the last thing here is, I think when you talk about degrowth, downscaling production and consumption, I think that there's a way that you could, and people have, dismissed that as being insufficiently concerned with things like class, or insufficiently concerned with other modes of domination and oppression, or it can be understood to be like, I don't know, a discourse of like white Europeans primarily and not other people. Some truth to all those critiques, whatever. You can find people to make that point better or worse. But I don't think that they're ultimate critiques. And I think the more we also look at people responding to liberation theology in the North, the more we discover that that's not the case. One really interesting voice that we had found is an Osage theologian named George Tinker. Super interesting guy. He's written a number of books, tons of really cool stuff. We should probably talk about him more on the show. But he had this really great essay where he's kind of talking about like white colonial power and how do we address it. And he kind of makes his way to then thinking through the international reality of colonialism and the importance of indigenous struggle in the North connecting with struggles in the South, and then kind of inviting white settlers into figuring out, well, what does that commit us to in the global North? And he has this pretty remarkable passage in one particular essay. This is in a book called American Indian Liberation. He says, "There will be enormous personal risks for all of us to our lifestyle and to our economic well-being." This is when we're dismantling the global structures of oppression. "Indeed, as we struggle successfully for this transformation, the economy of the United States must reduce its levels of consumption in favor of more equitable distribution of wealth in the rest of the world. Yet, we must be willing to take this risk, and we should be clear that any proposed solutions should be interrogated from the grassroots, from the everyday experiences of the marginalized, and not become just a new imposition from above. In this regard, we must get serious about reducing consumption." And I think that is really fascinating to hear somebody like George Tinker say, right? Like, he's basically spent the whole book being like, here's how indigenous peoples have been, resisting colonialism and how they need liberation and how they're working toward liberation. And in the end, he also kind of has this recognition of like the global structural imbalances of consumption in the North broadly. And I think it's just a really good example that helps like fill out, I guess like how sophisticated liberation theology is and how interconnected and impressive it is. And again, this is all like anticipating degrowth. Like, you could have read that same exact passage in a number of degrowth books, but it's in, it's not. It's not in one of those. It's in a book by an indigenous theologian. I think that's really rad.
Yeah, it's extremely rad. Yeah, I especially appreciate the part at the end where it's like, this can't be a top-down thing, but it has to be sort of a grassroots effort. Foreshadowing, I guess, or calling the shot of the emphasis on planning and democracy within degrowth, I guess. It kind of, it's not surprising that a liberation theologian would say that, but just like the resonance, I think, is very interesting to see. Sometimes when we are thinking and reading liberation theologians, like, maybe this is just like my own personal shortcoming in being a reader of theology, which I'm happy to accept. But sometimes people read liberation theology and be like, wow, these guys are saying some really radical things about stuff they've read in the Bible. Isn't that interesting? Doesn't that run? It's so interesting how that runs, kind of contrarily to the type of Christianity that I've heard at church. That's cool. So there must be something sort of interesting and socialist about it. And like we take those radical readings, and we take some of like the bumper stickers you'd read in A Theology of Liberation or whatever, and we say like, yep, that's liberation theology. But I think the more interesting point here that we see, I mean, from people from the global south, but also from the global north who are responding, that there's like this whole slew of like economic ideas that people are thinking about when it comes to liberation theology. This is not like, liberation theologians are not like just reading the Bible. They're not just like interacting with myths and stories from their own particular religion, right? They're coming up against all kinds of big economic problems that that impact not just people in the global south, but also people in the global north. And I think that is like astounding, actually, to start thinking about it. It's not just like some cool people reading the Bible in a radical way, but it's like people who are thinking about how do we give everyone like a better deal on the planet, not just us. So anyways, I think it's cool to read not only, I mean, like we talked about Boff and some stuff and people like that last week on the pod, and, you know, about dependency theory. That's all very cool. And now to hear sort of the commitment from people in the global north, from liberation theologians in the global north, about how we can kind of like pick up on some of those ideas and like participate in them and be in solidarity with them is really heartening. I mean, a lot of this stuff was written in the 70s and in the 80s, but these ideas are still with us. I mean, whether it's in the degrowth conversation or, you know, whether you're not interested in that part or whatever, I guess that's fine. But there's a real commitment to global solidarity, and the economics of it, I think, are just as important as the theology of it. So take all of this for what you will, I guess, and let's keep thinking about the economic side of things. I think that's a really important piece.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you want to think about the economic side of this podcast, you can go to patreon.com/themagnificast, and you can toss a couple bucks our way if you want. If you do that, you can get into our Discord, which has been pretty active lately because I'm using it to distract myself from writing the book. And lots of good conversations, a lot of complicated conversations about nuclear power today. That was fun to read about. People still talking about trash and garbage and many other things. It's a great community of folks who are fun to talk to. Our music is by Amari Armstrong, and our outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater, fall snow was glowing in the lights of the downtown. Saw a spark in your eyes, I just spoke it. Said we're gonna turn this whole place upside down. Then you said, my dear, do you really mean this? I said I would.